Jaws beached itself onto your NES back in 1987 and is obviously based on the incredibly popular Steven Spielberg movie of the same name. Jaws for the NES was developed by West 1-Bit Entertainment and published by everyone's favorite crappy licensed game publisher, LJN Entertainment. For those unaware, LJN became infamous in the NES days for striking up deals with every major movie and comic book license of the time, and then producing a string of some of the worst games ever made based on those licenses. Everything from X-Men to Beetlejuice was pushed through the LJN crap factory and resulted in just about every kid having experienced one of their awful games due to the attractive licenses they had locked down. Jaws is definitely one of the stranger games LJN ever tossed out though. I mean, how exactly do you make a game about the movie Jaws at all? And more importantly, should anyone ever make a game about Jaws? Well, go ahead and put on whatever shark repellent you can find, because we're about to see if Jaws on the NES is worth hunting down. Start up Jaws and you're tossed right into an overhead map that has you piloting a boat around. But before you can even get your bearings, the game sends you into an underwater shooting section that has you harpooning dozens of innocent sea creatures. Everything from jellyfish, manta rays, to small sharks are here to be mercilessly harpooned over and over again. At times, the innocent sea creatures you just murdered in cold blood will drop a shell to the bottom of the ocean floor that you can collect for no immediately obvious reason. Just as you get used to shooting stuff though, the game abruptly sends you back to that overhead map where you can move around a bit before you hit another jellyfish or something and are back to your sea creature killing ways. Also, occasionally Jaws himself will show up, but you do so little damage to him that you'll run out of time before you can even do a dent to his health bar. You basically do this over and over again until you eventually either get bored of the game and realize you've wasted a rental on this pile of a game, or you finally figure out what exactly it is you're supposed to be doing. Unfortunately for this review though, I don't get to return Jaws to the video store and forget about it, so I guess I should probably explain why and what you're doing, and how to progress in the game. Essentially, the goal in Jaws is to power up your harpoon gun to do enough damage to Jaws to trigger the final screen in the game. To do so, you'll need to pilot your boat back and forth between ports on that map screen, paying the amount needed to upgrade your boat and harpoon using the shells you've been mindlessly collecting from the sea creatures you kill as currency. The first item you'll get is a radio that allows you to hear when Jaws is close, while the rest of your port visits will give you a new power level for your harpoon. Do this about 4 or 5 times and your harpoon will now be strong enough to take Jaws down when he randomly shows up. If you can manage that, you'll be taken to a new screen where you can use depth charges to make Jaws jump out of the water. The goal here is to line him up in front of your boat and then use your boat to spear him as he jumps. It's actually easier said than done, since the game requires you to have Jaws at a very exact length from the boat and then have him lined up perfectly to finally spear him and beat the game. I say finally, but the entire game can be beaten within 20 minutes or less, so either consider yourself lucky that it's over, or kick yourself for spending $60 on a game that doesn't even last half as long as a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles episode. To be fair though, there is slightly more to the game than just going back and forth between ports and killing jellyfish over and over. At times you'll be able to find and pilot a small submersible on the map screen that moves around underwater way quicker than your standard diver, along with being able to shoot more powerful missiles and bombs at those oh-so-dangerous jellyfish. As cool as that sounds though, the speed the submersible moves is actually a detriment to it, since it's far too easy to run into a manta ray and lose it, since it only takes one hit before it's gone. Additionally, if you kill enough of the smaller sharks while you're underwater, you'll get a Galaga-inspired minigame where you drop bombs from a plane at jellyfish that swim in patterns beneath you. Shoot enough and you'll be able to gain an extra life or more shells, along with getting a ton of points for that all-important high score that literally no one cares about because it's a Jaws game. Beyond that though, that's really about all there is to Jaws. No, there's no real stages to beat or anything like that. It's literally just all about going back and forth to ports and killing jellyfish and manta rays over and over. There's not even any real challenge to the game either, besides dodging sea creatures and just how annoying it can be to line up that final hit on Jaws. I genuinely feel bad for anyone that bought this game back in the day and played through it before their TV dinner was done cooking. It's that short and easy, and there's no excuse for why this was being sold as a full-price game besides having Jaws on the front of that box. Jaws ended up being a game I never asked for, both figuratively and literally. I honestly can't recall any kid that was losing their mind to be able to run out and play a Jaws game. I know I certainly wasn't, but I somehow ended up owning it anyway due to a clueless family member that asked the cashier at Kmart what game he thought all the kids were buying. And since games back then were expensive and didn't come around too often, I ended up playing it for dozens of hours for no other reason than I was a kid and didn't want to go outside. Jaws honestly isn't as terrible as what the internet makes it out to be, but it's still not really good by any means. It plays fine, and there's a certain relaxing quality to the 10 or so minutes it takes to beat the game, though once you do, I seriously doubt you'll ever want to beat it again. In the grand scheme of things, Jaws was obviously part of whatever bulk licensing deal LJN secured, and then made it into a bare-bones game just because it was a popular movie, and LJN hoped at least a few kids were dumb enough to buy it. Much to no one's surprise though, even kids at the time didn't want a Jaws game, and it ended up languishing in clearance bins for years after its release. Even if you're a fan of Jaws, it's probably best to just do something better with your time than play this, like maybe just watch the actual movie again. As for this chum bucket of a game, just go ahead and toss it overboard. Battle Blaze awkwardly launched itself onto your Super NES back in 1994. Developed and published by Sammy Studios, Battle Blaze originally started out as a Japanese-only arcade game, but was then ported over to the Super NES to try and take advantage of the sudden popularity of fighting games that erupted with Street Fighter II's release. Well, that was the plan anyway. Amazingly, due to constant delays and Sammy's US office moving to another state, Battle Blaze didn't make it out onto the Super NES until 1994, years after Street Fighter II and Mortal Kombat had all but monopolized the fighting game market. But was it worth the wait, or was Battle Blaze just too little too late for Sammy Studios? Well, grab your favorite broadsword and loincloth, because we're about to see if Battle Blaze can slice up the competition. Start up Battle Blaze, and if you can manage to sit at the title screen for way longer than anyone ever would, you're treated to a brief cinematic that explains the story behind why everyone's fighting each other. Something about a demon that possesses the most powerful combatants in the land and then forces them to fight each other in a tournament. Carol, the character you play as, watches as his father defeats the Phantom trying to possess him, but then dies in the process, and vows to avenge him by winning the tournament in his stead. It's your bog standard needless fighting game plot, but I mean, at least it's in there. If the slow text scroll hasn't put you to sleep by now, go ahead and press start, where you get to choose from what amounts to being a single-player story mode or a versus mode. The story mode is essentially the meat of the game, so let's start there. Head into story mode and you're presented with a map on which you can choose your opponent. There are a total of 4 to choose, with a final boss fight appearing once you beat those 4. Yes, there are only a total of 6 characters in Battle Blaze. And to add insult to injury, you're stuck playing as the totally generic Conan wannabe Carol in story mode with no way to choose any other character unless you play versus mode. So just go ahead and choose which character you want to fight and get ready for battle. The actual fighting in Battle Blaze is, well, it's not very good. The overall movement of your character feels like he's underwater, and it doesn't help that the character you're stuck playing as is a lumbering mountain of muscle with a giant sword. You also know you're in for something special when a fighting game has jumping assigned to an actual face button, and not the fighting game standard of up on the D-pad, and Battle Blaze does just that. So get ready for some really awkward jumping attacks. You also get one single attack button besides the jump button, so don't go in thinking you're going to need to learn multiple punches and kicks, since your one attack button is responsible for literally every attack you can do in the game. Special moves are at least simple to pull off, with most being pressing the attack button while pressing left, right, up, or down on the D-pad, though none are really very impressive. It actually took me a few minutes to realize I was doing the special move and not the regular attack, since most of the special moves just kind of look like normal attacks anyway. Only a couple of characters in the game seem to even have projectile attacks, and of course your character isn't one of them. Thankfully, pressing back to block is in the game, but only seems to work when it wants to. Sometimes you can block just fine, and other times you'll take a hit even if you were pressing back to block the entire time. This leads to some incredibly annoying matches that, when combined with some of the cheapest AI ever seen in a fighting game, makes the story mode a really bad time. Even dragging your friend into the laughably simple versus mode can't save the game. In this mode, you do at least get all 6 characters to choose from, and then you're tossed into a coliseum to do battle in. At the very least, it's fun to try out some of the other characters here, but none are much more interesting to use than the default character due to the aforementioned boring special moveset that each character has. Some of the characters do have cool ideas, like this guy that can turn into a dog, or this standard anime guy that uses a sword that's way too big. But it plays so badly that few people would ever stick around long enough to even try to get good at a character. Unfortunately, there's just not much fun to be had here, in story mode or versus mode. Battle Blaze's gameplay is too simple, and yet somehow too frustrating at the same time, and it never comes together at all. When Battle Blaze originally hit the Japanese arcades in 1992, it could have gotten by as simply being an early fighting game in a time when fighting games were still trying to figure out what it takes to make something that was fun to play. But by the time Battle Blaze hit the Super NES in 1994, the time for excuses was long gone. And for us in the US that had no clue that a Battle Blaze arcade game even existed, this looked like a brand new fighting game that was out to compete with the likes of Super Street Fighter 2 and Mortal Kombat 2. Sadly though, this was just the same bare-bones fighting game from 1992 that had long since been outdated on consoles, and ultimately got lost in a sea of bad fighting games that were out at the time. Sammy Studios should have just cut their losses, tossed Battle Blaze to the side and focused on putting out a better game, but sadly that's just not what happened. And we got stuck with an ancient fighting game that was looking dated nearly 2 years before it was even released here. So if you're looking for an obscure Super NES fighting game to try, you have way better options than Battle Blaze. If you see it out somewhere and think you may have somehow missed out on an obscure gem, just go ahead and put it back down, since Battle Blaze is about as old and worn out as an ogre's loincloth. The Pirates of Darkwater set sail for your Genesis back in 1994. Developed by Iguana Entertainment, Pirates of Darkwater was based on the Hanna-Barbera cartoon of the same name. If you're unfamiliar with the Pirates of Darkwater, then don't feel too bad, since even us kids that watched cartoons back then barely cared about it, and it only lasted 2 seasons before it was canceled. But it at least managed to get a couple of games released for the Super NES and Genesis before it was tossed off TV. The Super NES game is actually completely different from the Genesis version. Developed by Sunsoft instead of Iguana, the Super NES game was a pretty boring brawler that isn't worth spending too much time on. It followed the standard formula of every brawler out at the time, which was just beating the hell out of everything you see on the screen and make it to a boss and then just do it all over again until the credits rolled eventually. It moved way too slow, looked and sounded awful, and was sadly not even worth a pity rental. The Genesis version, however, is a much more interesting game, and that's the one we'll be taking a look at today. So was Pirates of Darkwater a worthy representation of a show that got canceled before its time? Or was this just another licensed pile of shit that was based on a lame TV show that was destined for the clearance bin? Well, put on your favorite eye patch and pirate hat, because we're about to see if these pirates can stay above water. Start up Pirates of Darkwater and you're met with a lengthy story cinematic explaining the whole Darkwater thing and how it's slowly destroying everything it comes into contact with. It's all fairly standard kids fantasy stuff, with a dying father telling the main hero Rin that he has to stop the Darkwater by collecting 13 lost treasures scattered around the planet. To do this, he'll need to enlist the help of 2 other pirates, Tula and Ayaz, along with a talking bird thing called Niddler for that all-important comic relief. By far the coolest thing about the cartoon, though, was its unique and colorful sci-fi pirate setting, and it's in full effect in the game's opening cinematic along with that classic Hanna-Barbera art style in tow. Still though, the story here probably won't make you want to run out and watch the cartoon series anytime soon. After you've dealt with the backstory and are thoroughly ready to start messing up some Darkwater, go ahead and press start to get into the action. Before you begin though, you'll need to select your character from one of the 3 main heroes. Rin's a good all-around character, but doesn't really excel in any one area. Tula is of course the fastest of the bunch and has speedier attacks, but can't swing her weapon as far as the other 2 characters. Ayaz is the brute strength of the bunch, with a huge sword to swing at enemies, but he doesn't have the mobility of the other 2. Pick whoever suits your playstyle the most, or just whoever you think looks the most piratey, and then finally get ready to get into the game and start finding those lost treasures. Once you start, you're met with a much different game than what was presented on the Super NES. Instead of a by-the-numbers brawler, you get a side-scrolling action game here. But is it any better? Well, at the very least, you've got a game trying to do a little bit more than just aspiring to be a generic beat-em-up. Learning the ropes is easy enough, as each character can jump around the screen, swing their weapon, or activate whatever item they have selected at the time, which can be anything from a secondary weapon to keys to unlock doors. Dealing with enemies is nothing more than slashing at them with your weapon of choice, or by getting close enough and tossing them out of the way. If you have a secondary weapon selected, it'll shoot out in front of you, killing anything that comes into contact with it in one hit. Besides killing enemies, you'll need to make your way around the multi-level stages using your platforming abilities. Climbing up walls, jumping onto moving platforms, and finding your way to the exit is probably what you'll be doing most of your time while you're playing Pirates of Darkwater, since many of the stages have multiple paths to explore and can get pretty big. Also, Pirates of Darkwater is a huge fan of stage obstacles, so get ready to be dodging and jumping over stuff like falling rocks and slime-filled puddles. For the most part, you've got your standard action platform game here, but Pirates of Darkwater does at least have one neat little trick up its sleeve. Every stage you enter in the game has you meeting up with a character that has a sort of quest for you to accomplish. Some are as simple as just getting through the stage, but others actually introduce some light RPG questing into the game, like finding keys to open doors or collecting enough gold for someone to let you pass through. Sometimes there are multiple characters per stage that require you to do stuff for them, so it's not always about finding the exit as quickly as possible. Many times the objectives will send you exploring all over the stage in order to find what you need, and it's actually pretty fun to accomplish. It definitely gives the game more character than it probably deserves, as you'll be talking to tons of NPC characters along the way, and it really makes the game feel more alive and populated by doing so. Sadly, even though Pirates of Darkwater on the Genesis is a better game than the Super NES version, it still isn't very fun to play. There are definitely times where it can be fun to explore and complete objectives, but then the controls, combat, and just about everything else is there to get in the way of whatever fun you may have been having. First off, your character has one of the strangest jumps I've ever seen. It feels floaty and heavy at the same time somehow, making even the simplest jumps a gamble if you're not paying attention. The game also has everyone's favorite platform game sin, and that being fall damage. Yes, fall too far in a stage and you'll find yourself flat on your face and then teleported back to the last surface you were standing on. Combine that with the huge multi-level stages and you've got a recipe for throwing your controller at your cat in a fit of rage. Last but not least, this is also one of those games where you seem to take way too much damage from any hit, which is fine for a game that doesn't constantly have enemies jumping at you or things falling on top of you, but Pirates of Darkwater isn't that game, so expect to be dying a lot. It all adds up to make a thoroughly frustrating game that just can't stop getting in its own way, which really sucks since Pirates of Darkwater could have been a genuinely neat game. Much like the cartoon series though, Pirates of Darkwater just can't keep your attention long enough, even with the cool ideas it throws into the game. The whole questing aspect is ingenious, and it blows my mind that so few games back then ever used it. It seemed like a natural fit, especially in games like this that like to use these large multi-level stage designs. Even with the light questing though, there's just too many problems with the game to really stick with it for very long before you get annoyed and turn it off. It constantly makes you want to scream obscenities at the TV every single time you miss a simple jump or get hit yet again by another cheap enemy that was off screen. While I appreciate Iguana for doing something different for the Genesis, Pirates of Darkwater just has too many leaks and holes to stay afloat. Unfortunately for these pirates, I'd probably rather drown in actual black water than play this game again. Top Gun flew off an aircraft carrier and onto your NES back in 1987. Top Gun for the NES was developed and published by Konami and is very, very loosely based off the super popular Tom Cruise action flick of the same name. And unlike our review of Jaws a few weeks ago, Top Gun was a movie property back then that kids were actually way into. I know I was. Well, maybe not so much what was actually going on in the movie, but mostly because it had the most badass military jet ever, the F-14 Tomcat, flying around and blowing stuff up in it. Hell, I still don't know what the actual plot to Top Gun is to this day. I just wanted to see that awesome F-14 blow shit up. Thankfully, Top Gun the video game was poised to give me even more of what I wanted with a full-blown flight sim right on my NES. So did Top Gun the game scratch that itch of wanting to fly around in a crazy military jet on the NES? Or was it headed into a full-blown tailspin? Well, strap yourself into whatever cockpit you can find, because we're about to see if Top Gun on the NES can turn and burn. Start up Top Gun and you're immediately treated to a really great rendition to the main theme of the movie, though that's about all you're gonna get in terms of stuff from the movie that's in the game, so don't go in thinking you're gonna get some weird NES retelling of the movie's plot. Before you can get flying though, the game offers up a selection of 3 different types of missiles for you to use. You get a ton of the smaller missiles, though they have a super short lock-on radius and don't do much damage at all. The largest ones can lock on much further and do a ton of damage, but you only get 10 of them to use, so use them wisely. After you've picked your missiles, it's time to get off the aircraft carrier and shoot down some enemy fighter jets. Top Gun's first mission is more or less just a training mission to get you familiar with the controls and weapons. Being that this game is trying to be a flight sim, you control the action from the cockpit of your plane. Most of what's displayed in your cockpit is self-explanatory, like showing your missile stock, fuel reserves, and some altitude and speed readings. The main thing you'll need to pay attention to, however, is the giant radar screen that's sitting right in the middle of it all. The radar's main job is showing where the enemy jets are coming from around you, and this is a huge part of the game since you'd have no clue how to dodge or shoot incoming enemies if you couldn't see where they were around you. You can also tell what's what, as solid dot represent aircraft, while the hollow dots will be anything on land or sea. Your radar also occasionally pops up with other notifications, like if someone's locked onto you from behind, or showing your movements during refueling. Paying attention to the radar is imperative if you want to get very far in Top Gun at all, sometimes to the point where you're actually looking at the radar more than what's going on outside your jet. Once you get the hang of the radar, it's time to actually start shooting some bogeys down, and this is where Top Gun just can't quite pull it together. Since the game is trying to be a sim, don't expect super fast gameplay. Moving your jet around is generally slow and tedious, as is lining up enemy aircraft in your sights. While this wouldn't be a problem if the game was a true sim, Top Gun seems to only put this realistic gameplay limitation on you, since enemies seem to conform to no laws of physics known to man and can just fly all over the screen with no issue. Because of this, trying to shoot down most enemy jets is an exercise in frustration, as you seem to be flying the aircraft equivalent of a semi-trailer compared to their sports cars. Most of the time, it's just easier to avoid the enemies altogether rather than take them on directly, and that's just not what you want to be doing in this kind of game. Most of what you'll be shooting at will be enemy aircraft, though a few stages will have you fighting it out with ground targets as well. The ground targets are easy enough to hit, but can sometimes gang up on you in a hurry with missile launchers and machine guns, so it's usually best just to try to steer clear as many of them as possible. 3 of the 4 stages in Top Gun do throw bosses at you at the end of the stage, but they're all nothing more than giant stationary objects that you have to dump missiles into until they explode. Their only real challenge is just dodging all the crap they shoot at you, but it's not too hard to deal with if you know what you're doing. If you can manage to take the boss down and/or make it to the end of the stage, it's time to move on to Top Gun's most infamous gameplay, landing on an aircraft carrier. Yes, as you may already know, thanks to millions of angry YouTube videos, you have to manage to land your jet on an aircraft carrier before you can beat the stage. Whatever relief there may have been in beating the boss is quickly replaced by horrible anxiety as that prepare to land notification comes up on the radar. To successfully land, you'll need to try your best to match the speed and altitude shown on your radar, which sounds easy enough, but it's almost impossible to do in practice. Keeping your plane at the correct altitude isn't really hard at all, but keeping your speed where you need it to be is the true challenge, as it continues to go down and can only be sped back up by pointing the plane up, which then throws off your altitude. It becomes a super stressful game of balancing speed with altitude and praying you have it close enough to where it needs to be when the game finally lets you land. It really is incredibly difficult to regularly accomplish, even to this day. And for us kids trying to do this back in the 80s with no help from internet video tutorials, it was like a goddamn miracle when your plane finally touched down on that aircraft carrier. The game even throws this type of crap at you during mid-stage refuel attempts, though attaching the fuel line is thankfully a bit more simple than landing on the carrier. Still though, whoever at Konami was responsible for thinking that this was okay to put in the game can go straight to hell. At the end of the day, there were very few games on the NES like Top Gun, even if it doesn't quite hit the mark. The hybrid design of trying to be a flight sim and an action game just doesn't work, and since there's only a total of 4 stages to play through, the game's difficulty is off the charts in order to keep you playing as long as possible. Sadly though, the frustrating nature of just about every part of the game, especially the landing sections, won't keep too many people coming back for more. I personally loved playing this game as a kid, though I think it has more to do with the whole flying a virtual F-14 Tomcat than the game actually being any good, and sadly I just can't recommend it to anyone these days. While I commend Konami for trying something really unique on the NES, Top Gun just can't keep itself from bailing out before it even gets off the aircraft carrier.